June 19, 1944. High above the Philippine Sea, a formation of Japanese Zero fighters climbed into the bright morning sky. Their pilots had spent years mastering the art of aerial combat. Many were veterans of China, Pearl Harbor, and Guadalcanal. They had defeated nearly every Allied fighter sent against them, and to most of them, this mission felt no different. Then they spotted the Americans. The new fighters looked enormous. Their thick wings and bulky fuselages seemed almost laughable compared to the sleek, lightweight Zero. Some Japanese pilots had already nicknamed them flying tanks, convinced that such heavy aircraft could never survive a proper dogfight. The battle, they believed, had already been decided. What they didn't know was that America had stopped trying to build a better Zero. Instead, it had built the perfect Zero killer. Within a few hours, hundreds of Japanese aircraft would be falling into the Pacific. Within weeks, veteran squadrons that had dominated the skies since 1941 would be shattered beyond repair. Within a year, the fighter they had mocked would become the undisputed ruler of the Pacific skies. But this isn't simply the story of an airplane. It's the story of two completely different philosophies of war. Japan believed victory belonged to extraordinary pilots flying lightweight, highly maneuverable machines. America believed victory belonged to ordinary pilots flying aircraft designed to survive, adapt, and fight another day. One philosophy depended on individual brilliance. The other depended on engineering, teamwork, and industrial power. The F6F Hellcat wasn't the fastest fighter of the war. It wasn't the most graceful. And it certainly wasn't the most beautiful. But hidden beneath its rugged frame was a machine designed to exploit every weakness of Japan's legendary Zero. It could absorb punishment that would destroy lighter fighters. It could dive faster than its enemy could follow. And with 6.50 caliber machine guns, it could unleash a wall of fire capable of tearing apart even the most experienced Japanese ace in seconds. The pilots climbing into those Hellcats didn't know they were about to change the course of the Pacific War. Neither did the Japanese pilots who laughed when they first saw them. Before the day was over, many would discover that the greatest threat in the sky wasn't the aircraft they feared. It was the one they had underestimated. In the first months of the Pacific War, the Mitsubishi A6M earned a reputation unlike any other fighter aircraft in the world. Over Pearl Harbor, it escorted Japanese bombers with devastating precision. In the skies above the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies, Allied pilots quickly discovered that fighting the Zero on its own terms was almost always fatal. It climbed faster, turned tighter, and seemed to dance through the sky with effortless grace. To Japanese aviators, the Zero wasn't just a fighter, it was proof that superior skill could overcome superior numbers. Its pilots became legends. Many had trained for years before ever entering combat. They practiced relentlessly, learning to squeeze every ounce of performance from their lightweight aircraft. Against inexperienced Allied pilots flying outdated fighters, the results were devastating. By the end of 1942, confidence had turned into certainty. Japanese commanders believed their pilots remained the finest in the world. Then American intelligence began studying every encounter with the Zero. Recovered wreckage was examined piece by piece. Combat reports from surviving pilots were compared line by line. Engineers weren't searching for ways to copy the Japanese fighter. They were searching for its weaknesses. The Zero achieved incredible agility because it sacrificed protection. It carried very little armor around the cockpit. Its fuel tanks lacked the self-sealing technology found in newer American fighters. One well-placed burst of heavy machine gun fire could ignite the aircraft or cripple its controls. The challenge wasn't discovering those weaknesses. It was building a fighter capable of exploiting them. That responsibility fell to Grumman Aircraft Engineering. The company's designers listened carefully to the pilots returning from the Pacific. Again and again, they heard the same advice. Don't build another Zero. Build something better suited for American pilots. The result looked nothing like the sleek Japanese fighter. When the F6F Hellcat first appeared, its broad fuselage, powerful radial engine, and thick wings made it seem oversized. Compared to the graceful Zero, it looked slow, heavy, and almost awkward. Japanese intelligence officers studied photographs of the new aircraft. Some weren't impressed. A few veteran pilots even joked that American engineers had forgotten how to build proper fighters. If it's that heavy, one pilot reportedly remarked. "It will never turn with a Zero." From everything they had experienced since 1941, the conclusion seemed obvious. A heavier aircraft meant a slower aircraft. A slower aircraft meant an easy victory. On paper, their confidence appeared justified. The Zero weighed significantly less than the Hellcat and could still outturn almost any fighter in the Pacific. But appearances were deceiving. American engineers had never intended the Hellcat to win a turning contest. Instead, they designed it around a completely different philosophy. Give the pilot enough speed to choose when to fight. Enough armor to survive mistakes. Enough firepower to end a battle quickly. And enough strength to return home, even after taking damage. It was a fighter built for survival, not perfection. That difference was easy to overlook from a distance. To Japanese pilots watching through binoculars, the Hellcat was simply another large American aircraft preparing to repeat the mistakes of its predecessors. They expected young American aviators to chase Zeros into tight turns. They expected another display of superior Japanese flying. What they didn't realize was that the pilots climbing into those Hellcats had been taught an entirely new way to fight. Their instructors gave them one rule above all others. Never fight the Zero on its terms. Use altitude. Use speed. Attack once. Climb away. Then strike again. It wasn't as spectacular as the swirling dogfights that filled newspapers and newsreels. But it was devastatingly effective. The stage was now set for the first true test of Grumman's new fighter. Somewhere over the vast Pacific, two completely different ideas of air combat were about to collide. One relied on unmatched pilot skill. The other trusted engineering, teamwork, and discipline. Only one of them would dominate the skies by the end of the war. While Japanese pilots placed their faith in agility, engineers nearly 7,000 miles away were asking a very different question. What if the best fighter wasn't the one that could turn the tightest? Inside Grumman's factories on Long Island, New York, combat reports from the Pacific arrived almost weekly. Every damaged aircraft, every pilot interview, and every gun camera film was carefully analyzed. The conclusion surprised no one. The Zero wasn't unbeatable. American pilots were simply fighting the wrong battle. Again and again, experienced aviators described the same mistake. Young pilots would spot a Zero, pull into a sharp turn to follow it, and within seconds find themselves staring down the barrels of Japanese machine guns. The Zero excelled in close-range dogfights. So Grumman decided the Hellcat would avoid them altogether. Instead of sacrificing protection for agility, the engineers made a bold decision. The pilot would come first. Armor plates surrounded the cockpit, shielding the pilot from enemy fire. Self-sealing fuel tanks dramatically reduced the risk of explosions after being hit. The rugged airframe was designed to absorb punishment that would tear lighter fighters apart. To some critics, it seemed excessive. Every pound of armor made the aircraft heavier. Every extra layer of protection reduced maneuverability. But Grumman wasn't building an airplane for air shows. It was building a machine for war. Powering the Hellcat was the massive Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp engine, producing more than 2,000 horsepower. It gave the fighter incredible acceleration in a dive and enough raw power to climb quickly after making a high-speed attack. Unlike the Zero, the Hellcat didn't need to outturn its opponent. It only needed to control the fight. American instructors drilled this philosophy into every new naval aviator. Altitude is life. Speed is life. Never throw away your advantage. Instead of chasing enemy fighters through endless circles, Hellcat pilots learned to strike from above, unleash a devastating burst of fire, then climb back to safety before the enemy could react. It became known as boom and zoom tactics. Simple, disciplined, deadly. The Hellcat's 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns reinforced that strategy perfectly. A brief 2-second burst could send dozens of heavy rounds toward an enemy aircraft, often causing catastrophic damage before the Japanese pilot even realized he was under attack. American pilots didn't need to stay behind a Zero for long. One accurate pass was often enough. Even more important was what happened after the battle. Hellcats that returned riddled with bullet holes could usually be repaired within days. Ground crews often stood amazed as damaged aircraft rolled onto carrier decks with shredded wings, cracked windshields, or engines leaking oil. The pilots climbed out. The mechanics went to work. Soon, both were back in action. For Japan, the situation was very different. A damaged Zero was often beyond repair. A lost veteran pilot was almost impossible to replace. Years of combat experience disappeared in an instant. As the war dragged on, that difference became increasingly important. America wasn't just preserving airplanes. It was preserving pilots. Every experienced Hellcat pilot who survived one mission became even more dangerous on the next. Every battle created veterans instead of casualties. It was a cycle Japan struggled to match. Yet many Japanese commanders still underestimated the new American fighter. From a distance, they saw only its size. Its bulky fuselage. Its thick wings. Its heavy engine. They assumed all that weight made it inferior. What they couldn't see was the thinking behind the design. The Hellcat wasn't trying to be the most graceful aircraft in the sky. It was designed to keep fighting when other fighters could no longer stay airborne. Soon, Japanese pilots would discover that winning a dogfight meant very little if the enemy refused to fight one. And over the vast blue waters of the Pacific, the Hellcat was about to prove that survival, not maneuverability, would decide who ruled the skies. 4 months, the F6F Hellcat had trained relentlessly with American carrier squadrons. Now, it was finally about to prove itself in combat. Its first major test came in late 1943 during raids across the Central Pacific. As American carriers launched wave after wave of aircraft against Japanese positions on Wake Island, Rabaul, and the Gilbert Islands, Hellcat pilots encountered the enemy fighter they had been preparing to face for over a year. The legendary Zero. Many of the American pilots were entering combat for the very first time. Across the sky, experienced Japanese aviators expected another familiar victory. Instead, they encountered something they had never faced before. The Americans refused to fight their battle. Whenever a Zero tried to lure a Hellcat into a tight turning contest, the American pilot simply climbed away. Moments later, he would dive back down with overwhelming speed, fire a short burst, and disappear before the Japanese fighter could respond. Again and again, the same pattern unfolded. The Hellcat wasn't dancing with the Zero. It was hunting it. Japanese pilots quickly realized they were struggling to keep up with the new American tactics. The Hellcat could dive faster. It could absorb far more damage. And unlike earlier American fighters, it carried enough power to climb back into position almost immediately after attacking. One veteran Japanese pilot later recalled that the new Grumman fighter seemed unwilling to play by the rules they had mastered since the beginning of the war. It never stayed where they wanted it. It attacked only when it held the advantage. Then it vanished. American pilots were beginning to understand the Hellcat's greatest strength: discipline. Victory no longer depended on being the best individual pilot in the sky. It depended on teamwork. Carrier fighter squadrons flew in coordinated formations, constantly communicating by radio. Wingmen protected each other, called out enemy positions, and warned of approaching attacks. A lone Zero might outturn a single Hellcat, but it rarely fought just one. The Americans had transformed air combat into a team effort. The Japanese still relied heavily on individual skill. That difference became more obvious with every engagement. During one raid over Rabaul, Hellcat squadrons intercepted large formations of Japanese aircraft defending one of the Empire's most important naval bases. The fighting was intense. Smoke filled the tropical sky as aircraft twisted through clouds of anti-aircraft fire. Zeros attacked with their familiar aggression, but American pilots held their formations. Instead of chasing every target, they covered one another, waiting patiently for opportunities. The results stunned both sides. Hellcats returned to their carriers with bullet holes scattered across their wings and fuselages, yet most landed safely. Several damaged aircraft were repaired within days and flown again. Japanese losses told a different story. Many of the Zeros that failed to return carried some of the Navy's most experienced aviators. These weren't inexperienced recruits. They were veterans who had survived years of combat across the Pacific. Every loss weakened Japan's ability to train the next generation. Meanwhile, American confidence continued to grow. Pilots who had once feared the Zero now realized it could be defeated, not through reckless courage, but through superior tactics and a fighter designed to exploit its weaknesses. News spread quickly throughout the fleet. The Hellcat wasn't simply another replacement for the aging Wildcat. It was something entirely different. Carrier commanders immediately noticed the change. Escort missions became more effective. Bomber formations suffered fewer losses. American pilots returned with increasing confidence after every operation. Even maintenance crews began calling the Hellcat by a nickname that perfectly reflected its reputation: the Ace Maker. It wasn't because the airplane made flying easy. It was because it gave its pilots the chance to survive long enough to become experts. Each successful mission created more veterans. Each veteran made the next mission even more successful. For Japan, the opposite was happening. Every battle consumed experienced pilots faster than they could be replaced. The balance that had once favored the Zero was beginning to shift. Still, many Japanese commanders believed these defeats were temporary. They remained convinced that one decisive battle would restore their dominance in the Pacific. They didn't yet realize that America was preparing exactly such a battle. Only this time, hundreds of Hellcats would be waiting in the sky. And the outcome would forever change the history of naval aviation. June 19, 1944. The sun had barely risen over the Philippine Sea when radar operators aboard American carriers noticed something unusual. Tiny blips began appearing across their screens. Then more. And more. Within minutes, it became clear that this wasn't a small patrol. It was the largest wave of Japanese carrier aircraft the U.S. Navy had faced since the beginning of the Pacific War. Deep inside the Combat Information Center, officers worked with remarkable calm. Using radar, they tracked every approaching formation, calculating its speed, altitude, and direction. Unlike earlier battles, American pilots didn't have to search the endless Pacific for the enemy. They already knew exactly where the Japanese were coming from. Across the fleet, alarms echoed through steel corridors. Enemy aircraft approaching. Flight deck crews rushed into action. One after another, F6F Hellcats roared off the carriers, climbing rapidly into the bright morning sky. Within minutes, dozens became hundreds, spreading into disciplined formations as fighter directors guided them toward the incoming enemy. Far ahead, Japanese pilots believed they still held the initiative. Many had flown from carriers that represented the last hope of restoring Japan's naval air power. Despite the setbacks of previous months, they remained confident that aggressive attacks and superior flying skills could still overwhelm the Americans. They had no idea the battle had already begun. The first Hellcats struck from above. Instead of waiting for the Japanese formations to organize, American fighters attacked while they were still approaching the fleet. Diving out of the sun, they fired short, devastating bursts before climbing away to prepare for another pass. The Japanese tried to respond. Zeros turned sharply, searching for the familiar turning battles that had brought them victory for years. But the Hellcats refused to stay. They attacked with speed, broke away, then attacked again. Again and again, the same tactic shattered Japanese formations before they could reach the American fleet. Pilots who survived the first attack suddenly found themselves facing another from a completely different direction. Radio communication allowed Hellcat squadrons to coordinate every move. If one pilot missed his target, another was already diving into position. The sky became a deadly assembly line. Meanwhile, American anti-aircraft guns added another layer of defense. Any Japanese aircraft that slipped past the fighters faced a wall of shells from battleships, cruisers, and destroyers protecting the carriers below. For the attacking pilots, there was almost nowhere to hide. Within hours, the scale of the disaster became impossible to ignore. Japanese aircraft were falling into the sea faster than rescue crews could respond. Some burst into flames after a single burst from the Hellcat's 6.50 caliber machine guns. Others, damaged and low on fuel, never found their carriers again. American pilots could hardly believe what they were witnessing. One squadron after another reported extraordinary success. Entire enemy formations disappeared before reaching their targets. Veteran aviators later admitted they had never experienced anything like it. The battle was so one-sided that American flyers gave it a nickname that would become legendary: the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The phrase wasn't meant to mock the courage of Japanese pilots. Many fought with remarkable determination until the very end. Instead, it reflected how completely the balance of power had shifted. The Zero was no longer facing the inexperienced American pilots of 1942. It was confronting well-trained squadrons flying an aircraft designed specifically to defeat it. By the time the fighting ended, Japan had suffered catastrophic losses. Hundreds of aircraft were destroyed. But even more devastating was the loss of experienced naval aviators. These were men who couldn't be replaced by simply building another airplane. Years of combat experience vanished in a single day. American losses, by comparison, were remarkably light. The Hellcat had done exactly what Grumman's engineers intended. It protected its pilots. It allowed disciplined tactics to succeed. And it proved that survival could be just as powerful a weapon as maneuverability. When the surviving Japanese aircraft finally returned, many carrier decks were nearly empty. Pilots looked around for friends who would never land. Squadron commanders counted aircraft that simply weren't coming back. It wasn't just another defeat. It was the collapse of Japan's elite carrier air arm. From that day forward, the Imperial Japanese Navy would never again possess the experienced pilot force that had once dominated the Pacific. And for the F6F Hellcat, the battle marked the beginning of a new reputation. It was no longer the heavy fighter Japanese pilots had laughed at. It had become the aircraft that now ruled the skies over the Pacific. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot marked more than a crushing Japanese defeat. It marked the end of an era. 4 years, the Mitsubishi Zero had been the undisputed king of the Pacific skies. Its incredible agility had allowed skilled pilots to dominate nearly every opponent they encountered. But by the summer of 1944, the qualities that once made the Zero legendary had become serious disadvantages. The war had changed. Technology had changed. And America had changed even faster. The Zero had been designed before the war with one goal above all else: maximum maneuverability. To achieve that, its designers accepted difficult compromises. Armor protection was minimal. Self-sealing fuel tanks were largely absent. Every unnecessary kilogram was removed to make the aircraft lighter and more agile. In 1941, those sacrifices paid off. Against outdated Allied fighters, the Zero seemed almost unstoppable. But by 1944, American aircraft were no longer trying to match the Zero's turning ability. Instead, they attacked its weaknesses. Hellcat pilots avoided slow-turning battles and relied on speed, altitude, and teamwork. They struck from above, fired short bursts, and climbed away before the Japanese pilots could react. The Zero simply couldn't force the Americans to fight on its terms anymore. Even when Japanese pilots managed to get behind a Hellcat, victory was no longer guaranteed. The Grumman fighter could absorb astonishing amounts of damage. Bullet holes that would have destroyed a Zero often left the Hellcat still flying. Many American pilots returned safely despite severe damage to their aircraft, giving mechanics the chance to repair the fighters and send them back into combat. For Japanese pilots, the story was often very different. A single burst of .50 caliber fire could ignite fuel tanks, sever control cables, or tear apart the lightweight airframe. The aircraft that had once ruled the Pacific had become increasingly vulnerable. But the greatest challenge facing Japan wasn't the airplane. It was the pilot sitting inside it. By late 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy was running out of experienced aviators. The veterans who had fought over Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and Guadalcanal had been lost one battle at a time. Their replacements arrived with only a fraction of the training. Some new pilots received just a few months of instruction before being sent into combat. Many had never practiced carrier landings under wartime conditions. Others had little experience in aerial gunnery or formation flying. They were brave. But bravery couldn't replace years of experience. America, meanwhile, had built an entirely different system. Training schools continuously produced new naval aviators. Combat veterans returned to train the next generation. Lessons learned in one battle were quickly shared across the fleet. Every mission made American squadrons stronger. Japan's squadrons grew weaker. The difference became impossible to hide. Even Japanese commanders began acknowledging that the Hellcat had changed the balance of air combat. Reports from the front described an enemy fighter that was faster in a dive, heavily armed, remarkably durable, and flown by increasingly confident pilots using disciplined tactics. The Zero was no longer facing isolated opponents. It was facing an entire combat system. Factories produced replacement aircraft faster than Japan could destroy them. Escort carriers delivered fresh squadrons across the Pacific. Repair ships returned damaged aircraft to service. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and trained pilots arrived with astonishing efficiency. Every Hellcat represented far more than one fighter. It represented the industrial strength of an entire nation. As American forces advanced across the Pacific, Japanese pilots found themselves defending island after island with fewer aircraft, less fuel, and increasingly inexperienced crews. The outcome of each battle became more predictable. The Hellcat continued to build an extraordinary combat record, eventually accounting for more enemy aircraft than any other U.S. Navy fighter during the war. The Zero had not become a bad airplane. It had simply been overtaken by a rapidly changing war. The fighter that had once dominated the skies was now fighting an opponent built specifically to defeat it. By the final year of the Pacific Campaign, even veteran Japanese pilots understood the truth. The era of the Zero was over, and the aircraft they had once dismissed as too large, too heavy, and too slow had become the new master of the Pacific skies. But one final chapter remained. The Hellcat hadn't just won battles, it had helped secure Allied victory across the Pacific, leaving behind a legacy that would influence fighter aircraft design for generations to come. By early 1945, there was little doubt about which fighter ruled the Pacific. Wherever American carrier groups sailed, the F6F Hellcat was there. Escorting bombers, protecting the fleet, intercepting enemy aircraft, and clearing the skies before every amphibious assault. The balance of air power had completely shifted. Only 3 years earlier, Japanese aircraft had dominated vast stretches of the Pacific. Allied pilots often flew missions knowing they were facing an enemy with superior experience and one of the finest fighters ever built. Now, the situation was reversed. American pilots launched from their carriers with growing confidence, knowing they possessed both numerical superiority and an aircraft designed to survive the harsh realities of combat. The Hellcat became the backbone of the U.S. Navy's carrier air groups. From the Philippines to Iwo Jima and Okinawa, it flew thousands of missions in every role imaginable. It escorted dive bombers deep into enemy territory, attacked airfields, strafed military installations, and intercepted anything that threatened the fleet. Its versatility proved just as valuable as its firepower. Unlike aircraft designed for only one purpose, the Hellcat adapted to almost every challenge the Pacific War presented. Its rugged construction allowed it to operate day after day from crowded carrier decks despite the constant stress of takeoffs and landings at sea. Mechanics admired its reliability. Pilots trusted it with their lives. Even after hours of combat, many Hellcats returned carrying damage that would have destroyed lighter fighters. To the men flying them, the aircraft earned a reputation for bringing its pilot home. That confidence changed the way American squadrons fought. Pilots attacked aggressively because they trusted both their aircraft and the wingmen flying beside them. The emphasis was no longer on individual heroics. It was on teamwork. Every mission relied on disciplined formations, clear radio communication, and carefully planned tactics. The result was overwhelming. By the end of the war, Hellcat pilots had claimed more than 5,000 enemy aircraft, making the F6F Hellcat the highest-scoring fighter in the history of U.S. naval aviation. It achieved an extraordinary combat record of approximately 19 enemy aircraft destroyed for every Hellcat lost in air-to-air combat, a statistic that reflected not only the aircraft's design but also the training, coordination, and industrial strength behind it. For Japanese pilots, each passing month made the situation more difficult. Fuel shortages reduced training. Replacement aircraft arrived too slowly. Experienced squadron leaders became increasingly rare. Many young pilots entered combat knowing they faced opponents with better equipment, better logistics, and far more experience. Some fought with incredible courage despite impossible odds. But courage alone could not reverse the course of the war. As American forces pushed ever closer to Japan, the Hellcat played another critical role. It helped establish complete air superiority. Without control of the skies, Allied bombers could strike enemy positions with increasing freedom. Naval task forces operated with greater confidence, while amphibious landings received constant fighter protection overhead. The Zero, once feared across the Pacific, could no longer prevent these operations. Its era had ended. Ironically, the Hellcat never became famous because it was the fastest fighter of World War II. It wasn't. It never achieved legendary status because it could outturn every opponent. It couldn't. Its success came from something far more important: balance. It combined speed, firepower, protection, reliability, and ease of maintenance into one remarkably effective machine. Most importantly, it was designed around the pilot. Every engineering decision reflected a simple philosophy: keep the pilot alive so he could fly another mission tomorrow. That philosophy transformed the Pacific Air War. By August 1945, as the Second World War drew to a close, the skies above the Pacific looked nothing like they had 4 years earlier. The aircraft that Japanese pilots had once laughed at had become the standard by which every carrier fighter was judged. The Hellcat didn't just defeat the Zero. It proved that modern air combat was no longer won by the most agile airplane alone. It was won through superior training, disciplined tactics, industrial strength, and machines built to protect the people inside them. The Pacific War had begun with the Zero setting the standard for fighter aviation. It ended with the Hellcat defining a new one. And in doing so, it earned its place as one of the most successful naval fighters ever built, an aircraft that didn't simply survive the war, but helped shape the future of air combat itself. On that June morning in 1944, many Japanese pilots climbed into their Zeros believing they still commanded the skies of the Pacific. 4 years, that belief had been justified. Their aircraft had become a legend, and their victories had shaped the early course of the war. But wars are not won by reputation alone. They are won by those who learn, adapt, and evolve. The F6F Hellcat didn't succeed because it was the fastest fighter in the world. It didn't succeed because it could outturn every opponent. It succeeded because it was built for the war America was actually fighting, not the one Japan hoped it was still fighting. Every armor plate protected a pilot. Every self-sealing fuel tank saved another life. Every successful landing meant one more experienced aviator would fly again tomorrow. That simple philosophy transformed the Pacific Air War. By the end of World War II, Hellcat pilots had destroyed more than 5,000 enemy aircraft, earning one of the most remarkable combat records in aviation history. Yet its greatest achievement wasn't measured in victories alone. It was measured in the thousands of American pilots who returned safely to their carriers because their aircraft gave them a second chance. Looking back, it's almost ironic. The fighter that Japanese pilots once dismissed as too heavy, too bulky, and too slow, became the very aircraft that ended the Zero's reign over the Pacific. It proved that the future of air combat wasn't about building the lightest fighter or finding the sharpest turn. It was about combining technology, teamwork, training, and industrial strength into one unstoppable force. History often remembers the aircraft that looked the most elegant. But the F6F Hellcat reminds us that the machines which change the course of war are not always the most beautiful. Sometimes, they're the ones that simply bring their pilots home. And in the skies over the Pacific, the fighter that was once laughed at didn't just survive. It became the aircraft that ruled the sky, and the legend that the Zero could never escape.